Hi dear students, in this session 53 we are going to discuss about measure of dispersion. Previous session alli we discussed about measure of central tendency. In this session we discuss about measure of dispersion. Unit 5 measure of dispersion. Learning objective: to know the concept of dispersion, to know the meaning and definitions of dispersion, to know how to calculate range, quantile deviation, standard deviation and their coefficients, to know the applications of the dispersions. Learning outcome: ಈ ಚಾಪ್ಟರಿಂದ ನಾವೇನು ಕಲಿತೀವಿ? ಆಫ್ಟರ್ ಲರ್ನಿಂಗ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿಸ್ ಎ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ ಶುಡ್ ನೋ ದ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಡಿಸ್ಪರ್ಷನ್. ಇಂಟ್ರಡಕ್ಷನ್: ದ ಆವರೇಜ್ ಅಲೋನ್ ಕೆನಾಟ್ ಅಡಿಕ್ವೇಟ್ಲಿ ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರೈಬ್ ಅ ಸೆಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಅಬ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ಅನ್ಲೆಸ್ ಆಲ್ ದ ಅಬ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಆರ್ ದ ಸೇಮ್. It is the necessary to describe the variability or dispersion of the observation. What do you mean by this? For example, ಒಬ್ಬ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟು 6 ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾರ್ಕ್ಸ್ನ ತೊಗೊಂಡಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ವಿ ನೋ ದಟ್ ಮೆಜರ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲ್ ಟೆಂಡೆನ್ಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೌ ಟು ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ದ ಮೀನ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಕಲ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ವಿ ಲರ್ನ್ ಹೌ ಟು ಕ್ಯಾಲ್ಕುಲೇಟ್ ದ ಮೀನ್, ಬಟ್ ದಟ್ ಆವ್ರೇಜ್ ವಿಲ್ ನಾಟ್ ಟೆಲ್ ಆಲ್ ದ ಥಿಂಗ್ಸ್. ಅದು ಎಲ್ಲನೂ ಕೂಡ ಹೇಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಫಾರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್, ಆ ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ ಸ್ಕೋರ್ಡ್ 35 marks in one subject and 100 in another subject and 40 in one subject and 70 in another subject. Average will be more, but we have to calculate the variability. Variability ಅಂದರೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟಲ್ಲೂ ಸಹ ಸೇಮ್ ಇದೆಯಾ ಅಥವಾ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್. ಎಷ್ಟು ಆವ್ರೇಜ್ ಅಂತ ಕಂಡುಹಿಡಿಯೋದು ವಿ ಲರ್ನ್ಟ್ ಇನ್ ಮೆಜರ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲ್ ಟೆಂಡೆನ್ಸಿ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ ವಿ ಲರ್ನ್ಟ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಮೆಜರ್ ಆಫ್ ಡಿಸ್ಪರ್ಷನ್. According to A.L. Bowley definition, dispersion is the measure of the variation of the items. Yellow corner, dispersion is a measure of the extent to which individual items vary. And meaning of dispersion: dispersion or variation measures extent to which the term vary from central value. From central value, how it's going to vary? If average is 50, what about the others? Like if average is 60%, and what about the individual marks in each subject? Measure of dispersion give an average of the differences of items from an average. Objectives: to study the reliability of average, to control the variation, to make comparison among series, to make further statistical analysis. Kinds of measure of dispersion: there are two kinds of measure of dispersion. One is absolute measure of dispersion, next one is relative measure of dispersion. What do you mean by absolute measure? Those measure of dispersion which are expressed in the same units of the distribution for which these measures are obtained are known as absolute measure. How it is we are going to present. This is absolute measure. What is relative measure? A relative measure is calculated as the percentage or the coefficient of an absolute measure of dispersion. We consider absolute measure and we measure in percentage. This is called a relative measure. Different measures of dispersion: absolute measure, range, quantile deviation or interquartile range, mean deviation and standard deviation. Relative measures are coefficient of quantile deviation, coefficient of mean deviation, coefficient of standard deviation and coefficient of variation. Here you can observe, for all the absolute measure we calculate the coefficient. MCQ: from what we learnt, an average is more meaningful when it is examined in the light of central tendency, dispersion, skewness, moments. Means average is not enough, but we have to know the dispersion to get the more accuracy. Dispersion is also known as scatter, average, correlation, none of the above. Dispersion ಗೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹೆಸರು ಬಂದು scatter, nothing but ಚೆದುರುವಿಕೆ. Under dispersion, the frequency distribution is constant, semi-constant, vary or variation, none of the above. Means the frequency distribution will vary. ಒಂದು ಮತ್ತು ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ವ್ಯಾಲ್ಯೂ ಮಾಡಿ ಏನಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ it is changing. The objectives of the measure of dispersion are to study the reliability of average, to control the variation, to make comparison among series, to make further statistical analysis, all of the above. The objectives includes all A, B, C, D. So the answer is E. Fifth question: dispersion is a measure of the variation items. This definition is derived by A.L. Bowley, L.R. Corner, D.C. Brooks and W.F.L. Dick, Carl Pearson. Just recently we learned this definition is given by A.L. Bowley. The various types of measure of dispersion are categorized as absolute measure, relative measure, both A and B, none of the above. Friends, recently we came to know that there are measure of dispersions are of two types. One is absolute measure, next one is relative measure. Variation which is expressed in the same unit of the distribution is known as absolute measure. How it is we are going to measure? This is absolute measure. If you measure in percentage, that is relative measure. So 8th question: dispersion is calculated as the percentage is called absolute measure, relative measure, average, mode. This is relative measure. 9th question: Absolute measure of dispersion over includes range, quantile deviation, mean deviation, standard deviation. Friends, it includes all, so it is all of the above. Relative measure of dispersion over includes coefficient of range, quantile deviation, average, mode. The B, C, D are not related and they are not relative measure of dispersion, so A is the answer. So this is a bibliography or reference. S.P. Gupta, statistical method. Padmalochan Hazarika, business statistics. Let us meet in the next section. Thank you.